Okay, so for my presentation, I have chosen to do a study on Cubism, specifically a couple of artists who had an influence on it. Um, I had originally wanted to do the slave ship, but I was really struggling to find books and articles on the subject, so I changed it to Cubism. So, yes, Cubism and who had an influence on it. We'll be looking at Paul Cézanne, Pablo Picasso, Georges Barak, and Juan Gris. So, what is Cubism? Funny enough, it all started at the Salon des Independents in 1909 when a critic talked about cubes and Cubism was born. Um, so, the artist Pablo Picasso was actually the first artist to create a clear and rational lens with no aesthetic illusions. Um, he also then, from that, took the analysis of shape into a new direction and created fragmented forms into small cubes and other cube like shapes. Not all of them are squares exactly. Um, this was really interesting because now it became sort of a puzzle for the viewer to undertake for themselves and really actually causes the viewers to look closer at what the paintings are to try to figure out what the subject matter is. Um, Cubism is also mostly pretty muted work in terms of color value. Um, there's a lot more grays and blues and just earth tone colors in them as well, which makes it stands out. Um, yeah. So the artist that we're gonna look at is Paul Cézanne, who's top left, Picasso, who is top right, Barak bottom left, and Juan Gris is bottom right. So Paul Cézanne, um, he was not quite a part of Cubism as much. He actually just had a really big influence on Cubism. In the first exhibitions of Cubism, critics repeatedly referred to his significance for the young artists. Um, they stressed his significance in their development towards Cubism in their work, as well as just conversations that they would have. Barak actually said it was more than an influence, it was an initiation. Cezanne was the first to turn away from mechanized perspective being taught. And Andre Mason noted that you have to you have to divide a Cezanne's apple into four parts in order to make it easier to eat. And I just thought that was a really interesting, kind of funny analogy. So one of his paintings is The Five Bathers from 1992 to 1994, or 1892 to 1894. Most of his work was oil painting, and although the forms are not broken up into individual cubical forms and things like that, in the later works that I'll show, we'll be able to see a clear line from this to where other artists were going. Um, so the next one is The Cabin of Jordan. And here I feel like, along with the colors, um, the brushwork, and also how each brushstroke kind of implements a different shape, is also helping to move towards cubism. I believe this honestly could be considered a very slight early form of cubism work as well. So Picasso is the next artist. He was really interested in the human figure more so than other artists were. He was very elaborate in the buildup of forms in terms of small flat planes. Um, and his planes were also based on empirical observations that followed countless adjustments, fuse into the whole, and become inseparable from each other. Um, he also kept a lot of sketchbooks that can be seen and used to clarify the devices whereby an image was constituted. So the first one I chose from Picasso is the portrait of Ambrose Vollard. This is an oil painting from 1910. Um, I find this piece very, very intriguing. It's very obvious where the face is to me. However, the body form is way more complex to find. I also really adore actually the dark colors that he used in this portrait. Um, I think it's really fascinating the use of color in the face and how it kind of pops up in other areas of the painting as well. Here, I see mostly triangles as opposed to a lot of cubes. But it's interesting, the shape of the eyes as well as the shape of the nose in natural human faces kind of take on a shape of a triangle. So I think he did that very well, implementing that into this painting. The next Picasso painting I chose was The Girl with the Mandolin, oil painting as well from 1910. This is very different from the one we looked at just now in terms of color for sure, as well as subject matter itself. There are not as many shapes in here as there was in the one before. And that's also something I find very intriguing with Cubism is that there's no set amount of shapes you have to have. You can go very light on shapes, you can go high on shapes, you can have a ton, you can have little. So I think that that's also very interesting with that as well. Next is George's Baroque. Oh, so sorry. Next is George's Baroque. Um, he exemplified the analytical phase of the movement with his keen sense of structure and orderly method of decomposing an object. So instead of trying to kind of build up a figure like I feel Picasso did, Baroque is trying to tear it down into its individual structures and kind of decompose it in a way. He also, in 1911, introduced typographical letters into his canvases and soon began working in collages. And collages is also just a very interesting connection between Cubism um, and how Cubism actually helped in the progression of collage work as well. So the first painting I chose was Bottle and Fishes, which is an oil painting that he completed from 1910 to 1912. I actually love this painting because in high school I copied this one for an abstract art assignment. And I just fell in love with this painting. I think it is so intricate. And to this day, I actually did not know that it was titled Bottles and Fishes. And I never saw bottles or fish until just the other week when I was looking at this work. And I think that just goes to show how he did a very good job at reaching to fruition the aspect of decomposing and or decompressing and completely taking apart shapes and figures instead of trying to build them up into something that's more noticeable. So for that, I think he does a really great job in this. Also, we see the similar um, earth tone colors here, a lot more contrast than the last one from Picasso. And I also chose Clarinet and Bottles of Rum on a Mantelpiece by Baroque, which is also an oil painting completed in 1912. And in here, we can actually see the start of Baroque using words in his work, which then later transferred over into his collaging work. But this one again is just, it's so interesting to look at, and it's almost difficult to see the bottles and I honestly had a really difficult time seeing the clarinet, but I believe it's, gosh, it's somewhere in here. Um, but yeah, I think that he does a really great job in decomposing these different sorts of figures and objects. Well, mostly objects, which I think is also interesting. This can be done with objects, people, landscapes. It's just such a wide range of ability with this type of work. And lastly, I have Juan Gris. He actually went under a different name, Le Corbusier, and published a press Cubisme, which is just after Cubism. Yeah, so he the culmination of fragmentary perspects in a cubist painting highlighted the anxiety-ridden spirit of the time, yet he declared the cubists had not realized that they were creating a troubled art for a troubled time. um, Yeah, so his work makes it almost easier to identify the shapes and objects being used. And I think that his paintings are really interesting compared to Baroque, who, I mean, I have a hard time finding the the objects in Baroque's paintings. So the first one is called Portrait of Picasso, which I think is also kind of fun. He did a painting of a fellow Cubist painter. This is also an oil painting. So, something interesting about this is not only is there less shapes um, here. I mean, if we look at the body itself, there's it's broken into less shapes than what Picasso and definitely what Baroque were doing. Yet there's still plenty of shapes here to have it be classified as a cubist painting. Not to mention, the brush strokes in here are also very compelling and can also read as individual shapes themselves when looking closer to them. In comparison to Baroque's paintings that we just looked at, there is clearly a way there's an easier ability to identify that this is a person holding a paint palette rather than I'll just go back here and look at this one rather than the fish and the bottles. I mean, we have a bottle here and now we can see that there's fish and things like that, but it takes a moment to look at this to really understand what it is. When compared to this, it's like, oh, there's a guy and he's holding a paintbrush and all that. So that just shows the different forms and styles within Cubism itself. The next one we have is called The Table by Juan Gris, completed in 1914, an oil painting as well. And there are little bits and pieces here of typography being popped up. And this painting is actually very interesting to me because it actually looks like a collage rather than a painting itself. And this is something that also aids to showing the transition over into collage. I'm sorry, from Cubism too. So, and lastly, what there is to appreciate about Cubism. I think that Cubism is just such a unique art form. And it just gives a really interesting view into the minds of the artists and how they perceive things. We saw Picasso, who highly interested in figure, compared to Baroque, who just wanted to take these forms apart and abstract them as much as he could. And then Juan Gris, who is more, I believe, I think you could say, in the middle of Picasso and Baroque on that. Um, Definitely more identifiable in the figure that he did that was Picasso, especially in the facial features. It was just more, you could identify more where the lips, the mouth, and the hands were even. So I also think the multiple use of perspective as well as shape is what makes this style stand out far beyond anything else. Um, as well as just the addition to abstract art that Cubism has. There's nothing really like it before, and even looking at work today, like Cubism still just has such a huge part in abstract work now. And I can't even imagine what it would be like if it wasn't like that. Also, Cubism just highly encourages experimentation. There's so much varieties of Cubism and very much overtly Cubism to some more soft versions of it. Um, like I was saying before, I don't feel like there is a right or wrong way to do cubism. I mean, obviously, if there's no shapes involved at all, like that's obviously not cubism, but um yeah, I just think that cubism is just so unique and it's really important, and yeah, I just think it's great. And these are my works cited that I have, all these books, and I think I have one journal in here, but yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Figure out how to stop this. Oh, there we go. Okay, bye. Thank you.